Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Burstow. I'm the chair of the Tavistock and Portman NHS Trust, and my privilege is to chair this evening's proceedings. Really delighted to welcome you all here on behalf of the Trust and also the North Central London Research Consortium. Together we operate across some of the most diverse and poorest parts of London, and through the lenses of the both research fields and through the delivery of services, we see as organisations many of the issues that underline and drive mental ill health and physical ill health as well, and the challenges that people face in the communities that we're trying to serve. Today is the first of a series of conversations that we want to initiate. The aim really is to generate debate, so there will be time for questions at the end of today. And really it's, I think, a debate about a shift in investment, a shift in thinking, a shift of a paradigm, if you like, from one that is very much about going downstream and dealing with consequences, and instead looking at what causes wellness and where to put the money to support that goal. So I'm really delighted that this evening, to start this series of conversations, we have Sir Harry Burns, who's really dedicated his career to understanding how societies create wellness. He has a deep insight into these issues, not least fired by his experience in Glasgow as a consultant surgeon, where, as he just said to me, he spent too much time cutting things out of people that really probably could have been avoided in the first place, and that fired his desire to do different and do better. And he was appointed as the Chief Medical Officer in 2005 for Scotland, and is currently the Professor of Global Mental Health around the University of Glasgow. So without further ado, I invite Sir Harry to come and address us.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much for the invitation to be here tonight. It's always a pleasure to come and talk to an audience that might actually go out and do something about this. And basically what I'm going to talk about is well-being. What is it? What causes it? How is it created? Why do we need it? Go through all of that, and we'll start off with challenging an assumption. This, as you know, is the World Health Organization definition of health, promulgated in 1948, a complete state of physical, mental and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And in fact, just about all of us who have anything to do with the health service concentrate on that to the exclusion of the first bit. Okay? When I talk to doctors about wellness, they look at me as if I'm daft, because they know that wellness is the opposite of illness. Being well is not being ill. And they make people well by treating illness, or maybe even preventing illness if they're a public health doctor. But basically what I'm going to talk to you about is a kind of intellectual journey I've been on for the past few decades, where I've begun to realize that wellness and well-being comes from a different set of origins. It's not the absence of illness, it's about the way in which society comes together in order to create us as human beings and in order to allow us to live together in a socially acceptable way. I do, however, have a problem with the first bit of that definition. Health is a complete state of physical, mental and social well-being. State implies you're either well or you're not well. In fact, we all know that within minutes you can move from one end of the spectrum to the other, depending on whether your boss is shouting at you or whether your football team's just won, you know, if you're a Leicester supporter, for example. And that can create wellness, and then 5 minutes later you can be in the depths of despair. So a better definition of health, I think, and well-being is a homeostatic one. The ability to adapt and to self-manage and to maintain your whole sense of interaction with the world round about you within a reasonably narrow set of limits, irrespective of the challenges that confront you. We all meet challenges every day, and we are well if we're confident that we can meet those challenges. So this journey of mine, as you've heard, began when I was operating on people in the East End of Glasgow. And as a surgeon, most of the lifestyle-related problems I had to deal with were things like GI bleeding, people drinking too much and so on. And you'd come in, I remember one guy came in and I said, came in with recurrent acute pancreatitis. How much do you drink? Oh, not very much. Go on, tell me, how much do you drink? Well, about 14 pints. 14 pints a day, I said. I said, no, at lunchtime. I said, at lunchtime? Aye, we get time off work. And I went, you mean you drink 14 pints and you go back to work? What's your job? He said, well, you know those big high cranes? You know, I drive one of them. So I thought for a minute and I said to him, is there a toilet in those things? To which he replied, only in some of them. So if you're ever walking past them in a high wind, make sure you go upwind of them, all right? The point was, when you ask these guys to stop drinking, why should I bother? What have I got to live for? And that provoked an interest in this whole question of the social determinants of well-being. And I began to question a lot of the received wisdom that I saw, because I was an academic surgeon and I was used to asking questions about the illnesses that I dealt with. And these are the sort of statements that are made about Scotland's health. They may well be statements that you recognise as being said about people in the East End of London or the North of London or whatever. We're unhealthy because we smoke too much, we eat the wrong kind of food, we drink too much, and if only we would man up and do the right thing, we'd be as healthy as anyone. You recognise that? Is that what you're supposed to say? Well, only one of those statements turns out to be true. And unfortunately, it's the one about the drink, okay? We drink too much, and I'll come back to that. But the point is, our society is full of single explanations for complex problems. It's much more complicated than that. And when you begin to look into the detail, you find that actually we've just taken the things that the newspapers like to write headlines about and turn them into fact. For example, we're not unhealthy. We got life expectancy data from 16 Western European countries going back to 1851. Okay, that's 160 years worth of data. The blue line is Scottish life expectancy. You can see the impact of the Second World War here, First World War, various bits of Franco-Prussian unpleasantness in the 19th century. For most of that time, Scottish life expectancy is at the middle of the European average. It's only in the past few decades, only since the 1950s, that our life expectancy growth has slowed down and the rest of Western Europe has overtaken us. And if you look at the rate of growth of life expectancy in the richest 20% of the population and compare that to the rate of growth in life expectancy in the poorest 20% of the population, that's what you see has happened since the 1950s. If the gap between rich and poor that existed in the 1950s had been maintained all the way through, Scottish life expectancy would be at the European average. Scotland's poor health is a reflection of the health of the poor, all right? And we need to unpick that a bit. Now, is it due to cigarettes? No. This is a World Health Organization study looking at smoking rates in 15-year-old teenagers. Scottish teenagers are the 5th lowest smokers in that study. Another study of European male smoking rates, Scottish men turned out to be the 3rd lowest, beaten by Finland and Sweden. England is further down there somewhere. Not on that slide, but you know. Yeah, there are social patternings here. Poorer people smoke a lot more than rich people, but overall, that's not our problem. Scottish women let the men down a bit by being closer to the European average, but we're not where we are because we smoke so much. What about heart disease and diet? That yellow line on that graph is heart disease mortality under the age of 75 in men in Finland, okay? And you all know that Finland took radical action to deal with its high heart disease mortality. The North Karelia project, the Finnish government, I once asked the director of the Finnish Institute for Public Health, how did he change the Finnish diet? And he said, well, the Finnish Institute of Public Health told the Finnish government what to do, the Finnish government told the Finnish people what to do, and the Finnish people did it. To which I replied, aye, try that in Scotland, pal. But in essence, what the Finnish government did was they took subsidies away from dairy farmers to discourage them from producing butter, milk, cream, cheese, and so on, thereby making the Finns the most miserable people in Europe. And they gave them the subsidies back if they'd switched to growing fruit and vegetables. And they made free fruit and free salads compulsory in all schools and workplaces. And then they stood back and patted themselves on the back because you see that yellow line falling. Okay? But you see the pale green line next to it? That's the Scottish heart disease mortality trend over the same time. Finns took radical action to change their diet. Scots did absolutely hee-haw to change their diet. And it made no difference. Every Western country has seen a fall in heart disease mortality since the 60s, predominantly because men gave up smoking in great numbers since the 1960s, but also because of the introduction of statins and other drugs to treat heart disease. So here you see an example of the causation rather than the association rather than causation fallacy. They did something and that happened, therefore that must have caused this. No, it didn't. Other things were happening. And epidemiology is bedeviled by people misinterpreting the data. It's not fat that's causing the problem. We began to get some insight into what was happening here when we started to look at this particular calculation, slope index of inequality. What you do is you look at the mortality rates by deprivation quintiles across the population. The blue one there is the most affluent quintile all the way down to the purple one, the most deprived quintile. You look at mortality rate, you essentially subtract the best from the worst and divide by the mean, and that gives you a number that equates to the steepness of the inequality curve. And you see there a line, an inequality gradient that's about 45 degrees is equivalent, comes down to a number very close to 1. If you do that for 5-year age bands across the population, you can see which bit of the population has the steepest inequalities. And that's what it looks like. Inequality in the Scottish population shoots up between age 10 to 15. It's at its highest between 30 and 40, and it starts to come down from 45. Inequality is not a feature of death rates in the older population. And what is it about the older population? Well, the older population are the people who tend to die of heart disease and cancer. And you can look at the contribution of heart disease by looking at the slope index of inequality for individual causes of death. There's an example of ischemic heart disease in the middle. You do that for 5-year age bands, and that's what it looks like. Heart disease isn't a big driver of inequality and mortality. So what is it that's causing this huge bulge to the left? It's not heart disease, it's not cancer. It's drugs, alcohol, suicide, violence, accidents, chronic liver disease. Okay? You're not going to fix that by reducing the saturated fat content of the diet. These are psychosocially driven causes of death. These are causes of death that are occurring in young working age people and are probably a reflection of the social circumstances in which they're living and the mental health issues associated with that. And if we look at the alcohol stuff in a bit more detail and look at the time course of this, we see how relatively recent this is. This slide summarises the data of our 16 Western European countries since 1950 for chronic liver disease, predominantly due to alcoholic liver disease. The line at the top is the highest mortality any country reached since 1950, and most of that to the left is France. In the 50s and 60s, they had very high alcoholic liver disease rates. The line along the bottom is the minimum level of mortality any country reached, and the thick line in the middle is the mean of our 16 Western European countries. And from 1950 to 1970, that's where Scotland was. Okay? One of the lowest death rates from alcohol in Western Europe. This notion of Scots as happy drunks is a myth, okay? Mainly because we're not very happy most of the time. But from 1970 to 1990, it went like that. Went up a bit, was still below the European average. And from 1990 to 2005, it went like that, okay? For both men and women, we went from being one of the lowest to being the highest, having the highest alcoholic liver disease rates in Western Europe. And given that that has been brewing for a decade or two, then you can begin to see that these changes that we see probably emerged in the 60s and 70s. Certainly the drinking culture has changed, because in the 50s and 60s, who would drink in Scotland? Well, men would drink. What would they drink? It would be beer. Where would they drink it? In a pub. When would they drink it? At the end of a working week. Now, who drinks? Everybody. What do they drink? Everything. Where do they drink it? Everywhere. And when do they drink it? All the time. Our whole culture has changed, with young people being driven to clubs and getting onto this treadmill. And we're brewing a time bomb here of alcoholic liver disease, I suspect, as these people move into older age groups. So what changed in the 50s and 60s in West Central Scotland, which is the area most affected by these changes? Well, the first thing that happened was there was a catastrophic loss of employment. 20 miles on either side of the Clyde, any working week at 5 o'clock, this is the picture you would see. Hundreds of thousands of men leaving the shipyards. In 1900, I'm told 70% of all merchant shipping tonnage launched in the world was launched from the Clyde that year. It was a huge industry, and it was an industry that gave meaning and purpose to the men who worked in it. If you were a riveter or a welder in the shipyard, you had status in the community. And these jobs disappeared in the 60s and 70s. And they were never adequately replaced by any other consistent employment. The north of England lost jobs as well, but you had car factories, you had consumer electronics and so on. We were never successful in getting industries to take root in Scotland. And at the same time as the industrial landscape was changing, the community landscape was changing. Post-war, there were two plans enacted to create more livable housing in West Central Scotland. That's a picture of the Gorbals, famed for being slums and so on, but in the 19th century, it was anything but. Those are the houses and those are the people. And the thing you notice are the people. There's a community there. The adults are out talking, the children are out playing, they're looking out for each other. There's a community and a sense of community there. And the glue in that community would be the women. Young mother struggling with a family or whatever, the older woman would help her, give her advice, and there was a sense of we're all in this together. In the 1950s, a town planner in Glasgow decided that he was going to knock everything down, basically, and he was going to replace all the houses with more livable housing, which are now almost all been knocked down again because they were a nightmare. They were filing cabinets for people. And the people who had been part of a community were disseminated around the city. Most of them wouldn't have telephones, certainly no mobile phones. So friends they'd had for years, they lost. Peripheral housing estates like Easterhouse, 35,000 homes, 2 shops and a pub, not even a primary school when it started. Appallingly inadequate planning that just disrupted community. And from that, and after that, we began to see the emergence of problems. And it was those problems that turned me to starting to look for solutions, because it was very clear that we couldn't just go on assuming that gang violence was because boys were bad. There had to be something underlying all of that. And I came across the term salutogenesis. Doctors are obsessed with pathogenesis, the causes of disease. Salus was the Roman goddess of well-being and the Roman goddess of safety. And colleagues in the Nordic School of Public Health drawn this slide. Salutogenesis, 25 different theories they've pulled together that describe what causes well-being, what causes a sense of wellness in individuals. And I'm not going to go through them all, as you'll be glad to hear. But the one thing you notice, having read most of the original texts here, is that there are certain commonalities with all these different theories. People tend to be well if they have an optimistic outlook on life. And when we did studies in Glasgow, one of the things we measured was Isaac's personality inventory. People who score high on extraversion, coming from the most deprived parts of the city, are as healthy as people who come from the most affluent parts of the city. And I once asked the professor of psychology, what does Isaac's personality inventory extraversion score mean? And he said, I don't know, and I don't think Isaac knew either. But it's obviously good for your health. Having a sense of control over your life, and it's an internal sense of control. You are the captain of your own fate, not other people. Having a sense of purpose and meaning in life, being confident in your ability to deal with problems, this resilience, this notion of health as being adaptability and so on, and being surrounded by a supportive network of people and having had a nurturing family comes through very strongly in all of them. The guy who really made me sit up, because I was on a journey to try and find what were the biological consequences of poverty. In all my time as a clinician, I never once filled in a death certificate that said he died because he was unemployed. He died because he lived in a bad house. But yet we knew that that was associated with premature death. So what was it about social chaos that led to adverse biological outcomes? And it was this guy, Aaron Antonovsky, who first put me on the track that I think chain of events that explains this. Antonovsky was an American sociologist who studied the health of adults whose children had been in concentration camps. 70% of them, he discovered, were very unhealthy, mentally unhealthy, physically unhealthy, socially they were failures. 30% of them had done well. And from his interviews with these people, he concluded that the children who did well had acquired, before experiencing these terrible events, a thing he called, they'd acquired what he described as a sense of coherence. And a sense of coherence, he said, is a feeling that the events round about us were structured, predictable, explainable. A feeling that we have the internal resources required to meet the demands that the external events challenged us with. And thirdly, that we saw those demands as challenges that we wanted to engage with. A sense of purpose, a sense of resilience, a sense of adaptability, and a sense of understanding. And the bit about Antonovsky's book, Health, Stress and Coping, that made me sit up was that he said that to create health, the social and physical environment must be those three things: comprehensible, manageable, and meaningful. Otherwise, we would experience a state of chronic stress. Now, I was a surgeon, and my job was to create acute stress in people. It's what a surgical operation is. It's an acute stressor. As soon as you have that anaesthetic, as soon as you get the tissue trauma and so on, the body produces cortisol, adrenaline to mobilize energy sources. It begins to kick in all sorts of proteins to be involved in the healing response. And what Antonovsky was saying was that children who didn't learn to have this sense of coherence would be chronically stressed by the fact. What he actually said was, Children who don't have a sense of coherence interpret all the events round about them as noise, not as information. And they're stressed. So we began to look for evidence of chronic stress in children and adults relating to social circumstances. And of course, there's thousands of papers in the literature. This is Canadian data from looked after children in orphanages. The longer a child is in an orphanage, the higher its salivary cortisol is. Something chronically stressing to a child from not having a single significant adult to attach to. This is data from Michael Marmot's Whitehall study. Daytime cortisol profiles in higher grade and lower grade civil servants. Higher grade civil servant, cortisol is always highest in the morning, goes down before bedtime at night. Throughout the day, lower grade civil servants are more stressed than higher grade civil servants. The least stressed person in any government department is the permanent secretary. Why? Because he's the boss. And if a minister asks a permanent secretary to do something he doesn't fancy doing, he just gets somebody else to do it. And then eventually all the rubbish no one in any government department wants to do lands on the desk of the chief medical officer who's permanently stressed by the experience. Point is that control is minutely and inextricably linked with this business of chronic stress. Even at whole government level, Martin Bobak from Michael's department went round the countries of the former Soviet bloc 10 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Along the bottom there are the results of a control questionnaire. He asked 1,000 people in each country, how much control do you feel you have over your life? Standardized death rates are down the left-hand side. Russians in the top left-hand corner, highest levels of mortality, lowest levels of control, all the way down to the Poles and Czechs. High levels of control, lowest mortality. In this country, people in the poorest areas have mortalities broadly similar to the Baltic states. Another interesting study, Susan Everson, an American lady who studied the health of who studied men in Finland at high risk of premature death from heart disease. And she measured everything you could think of. It was a great big fishing expedition. One of the things she did was she had a questionnaire on hopelessness that allowed her to divide men into three groups. Men who were very, very hopeless, men who were moderately hopeless, and men who were just a little bit hopeless, because as a woman she understood that all men are hopeless to a greater or lesser degree. She adjusted her results for the prevalence of other risk factors like tobacco and alcohol and obesity and so on. And she found that hopelessness was an independent predictor of heart disease, cancer, and a whole range of causes of death. Psychological negativity, which is bound up with all these causes of well-being, the salutogenic stuff, was a very powerful driver of chronic ill health as well. So what was the link? What was the link between all these social events and this increased risk of physical ill health, mental ill health, and so on? And the best way I've got of explaining that to you is to describe to you an experiment I saw in the psychology department of a New York university. And the experiment was they made baby monkeys depressed, okay? You can see that's not a happy baby monkey. And what they did there was they changed the way mum was allowed to feed the baby. One half of the animal house, mum's playing with the baby, the food's down beside her. When baby indicates that he's hungry, she just leans down, picks up the food, gives it to the baby. The other half of the animal house, they take the food away. Mum has to go and forage for it. She's away for a long time. She has to fight with other mums to get the food. So mum is away for a long time and she's stressed by the experience. So if I were to ask you, which babies do you think were stressed? Is it one where mum's there all the time or the one where mum's away a lot and is stressed by being away? You would naturally think it's the second group of babies, wouldn't you? Yeah? And when I ask that question, I can usually spot the working mums in the room, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Well, actually, it doesn't matter. The green triangles there are the stress hormone levels in the babies where mum finds it easy to feed them. The yellow triangles are the stress hormone levels where mum finds it hard to feed them and it doesn't make any difference. But the red triangles are where they randomly change the feeding pattern from one day to the next. It's not mum being there or mum not being there. It's baby not knowing. It's inconsistency. And if you think about it, what's the first stressor a human baby feels is hunger. So what happens when he cries? Mum picks him up, cuddles him, talks to him, feeds him. Stress resolved. So that sort of tennis match, serve and return, happens 100 times, 1,000 times. Baby learns that the world is structured and predictable, and he's in control. Because he cries, this nice person comes along, fixes it, and everything's okay. Structured, predictable, explainable, controllable. Contrast that to the experience of a baby who, when he cries, sometimes gets fed, but sometimes he doesn't because mum's drunk or under the influence of drugs. And even worse, the boyfriend picks baby up and shakes him and slaps him because he doesn't know how to calm a stressed baby. Baby learns the world's not structured and predictable. He's not in control. He doesn't have this sense of coherence. And according to Antonovsky, that would upregulate the stress response. Not only does it upregulate the stress response, but we know how it upregulates the stress response from the work of Bruce McEwen at Rockefeller University in New York. What Bruce has shown in stressed animals is that that kind of adversity in early life leads to changes in the brain in 3 key areas. 2 areas of the brain do not develop so well in stressed babies as they do in unstressed babies. The prefrontal cortex is the bit of the brain that allows you to process new information. You take the new information and you process it, and that's the bit of the brain that makes the world seem structured and predictable. Allows you to respond appropriately to new information. So that doesn't grow such dense cell connections. The hippocampus doesn't grow such cell connections. And that's the bit of the brain that allows you to learn. It's the bit of the brain where you integrate short and long-term memory. So these kids are less well able to learn, less well able to suppress inappropriate behavior. The interesting thing about the hippocampus is it's the bit of the brain that has the densest concentration of cortisol receptors. And if it's smaller, that's the bit of the brain that you rely on to suppress the stress response. The third bit of the brain that changes its function is the amygdala, which is important for emotional arousal. And it becomes more active in stressed babies. So they become more anxious, fearful, aggressive. And this is all part of the body's defense mechanisms. They've experienced a chaotic and difficult childhood. They're on a short fuse emotionally. They have a chronically high level of stress responses because the stress response is what you need to run away or fight. And when I talk to teachers and talk to them about kids who don't learn well, who don't behave appropriately in new social settings, and who are on an emotional hair trigger, you can see them nodding because they recognize S2 boys. That's what's out there. And we took Bruce's stuff and we took it out into the streets of Glasgow. We got lots of volunteers to have their brains scanned. We measured hippocampal volume. We measured white cell density, did all sorts of other clever imaging things. That's what's out there. We also measured a whole range of psychometric tests, and I'll just show you one. Choice reaction time measures the length of time you take to integrate new knowledge into your prefrontal cortex. Computer, new information, measures the length of time you take to press a button. The lighter bars are most deprived people, the darker bars, least deprived people. On average, it takes someone at the lower end of the social scale about 200 milliseconds longer to process the information. And if that doesn't sound a lot, if you imagine 2 cars being driven side by side at 50 miles an hour, rich guy, poor guy, child walks out in front of the 2 cars, car being driven by the poor guy will take 1 to 2 car lengths longer to stop. That's the length of time it takes him to process longer. It takes him to process that new information that he's going to hit someone. So poor people are being handicapped in all sorts of ways that we don't appreciate. This is the molecular biology of a cuddle, okay? This is what happens when you cuddle a baby. It's probably what happens when you cuddle me, but I guess that may depend on who's doing the cuddling. And it's epigenetic regulation is responsible for the reduced cortisol receptors. We now know that the genes that you have are fine, but it's whether or not they're switched on that matters. When you cuddle a baby, he releases serotonin, 5-hydroxytryptamine, into the bloodstream. Serotonin stimulates production of a transport mechanism in the cell wall that carries the serotonin into the nucleus of the cell. Chromosome number 5 has a locus on it that codes for the glucocorticoid receptor gene. Babies who are neglected, who are not comforted, do not produce the serotonin that allows them to produce the cortisol receptor. So they have the chronic elevation of the stress response. So here we have a chain of events that show that child neglect leads to lots of behavioral problems, lots of criminality because they can't suppress inappropriate behavior, that leads to chronic elevation of stress responses that has biological consequences. And, you know, the evidence now on epigenetic regulation over Kalix, a town in the north of Sweden, where they've got very precise nutritional records going back into the end of the 19th century. What they've shown is that there is an epigenetic problem in children who experienced oversupply of food. You know, they would go from one year to the next with oversupply, then there'd be a few years of famine and so on. The children who experienced oversupply of food, they went back and looked at their death records. Premature death was increased. But then they discovered that irrespective of nutritional status of their children and of their sons and grandsons, they also experienced increased risk of heart disease. So the epigenetic regulation is not just for one generation, there's the possibility of it being handled on to subsequent generations, and we're learning more and more about that now. And it's not just Scots, not just west of Scotland people that experience this. The Adverse Childhood Event Study carried out in California looked at, and middle-class Californians at that, members of the Kaiser Permanente health system, looked at 9 different types of adverse events in a child's life and related it to adverse outcomes. Children who experienced 4 or more of those adverse events were 8 times more likely to experience alcoholism, 12 times more likely to be narcotics users compared to children who experienced none. Boys who experienced physical violence at the hands of a parent, 8 times more likely to engage in partner violence when they grew up, 4 times more likely to be arrested for carrying weapons. Their cognitive functioning was looked at in another study. What you've got here is the position on the percentile scale, cognitive function at age 22 months. The line at the top are high socioeconomic status babies. These are low socioeconomic status babies. So the kids who were performing at a high level at age 22 months, if you were poor, it declined up until the age of 10. If you were low socioeconomic status and had a low performance at 22 months, it stayed low. But the high socioeconomic status kids improved. So the experience in the first few years of life continues to work on your ability to grapple with life's challenges. Studies carried out relating children's mental health problems to family income show the same thing. Children whose family income is lower on the left-hand side, much more likely, almost 3 times more likely to experience mental health problems compared to more affluent children. So the social circumstances in which you're born and in which you're raised begin to dent your ability to make a success of life. This is Mark Bellis's data, where he's looked at the impact of adverse events on chronic disease in the north of England. And what he shows there, that black line is adults who experienced 4 or more chronic diseases in early life. In their 60s, they are twice as likely to have a major illness compared to children who experienced no adverse events in their early life. 70% having a major disease in their 60s if they've had 4 or more adverse events. So it's not just mental health problems, it's life course issues that children have as a result of neglect and abuse. That's the pattern of mortality and of morbidity in the Adverse Childhood Events Study, the Californian study. 2 lines at the left are increased risk of heart disease and cancer. That's the pattern of adverse events, the pattern of excess mortality in Glasgow. So the supposition is that the chaotic lives that children were born into in the 50s and 60s now beginning to produce within that cohort of adults this widening inequality in mortality. Same thing's been seen in New Zealand, 1,000 children identified in the 1970s, a subgroup identified as being at risk at age 3. They're now in their 40s. They're more likely to be unemployed, have criminal convictions for violence, experience teenage pregnancy, be substance misusers, and they've got signs of metabolic syndrome, precursor of diabetes, heart disease. That's what's out there. That's what's happening. And I wouldn't say all traces back to childhood, but my bet is the vast majority of it traces back to childhood. The economics of this are terrifying. This is data from the Californian study. They've calculated that 1 year's worth of child neglect in the United States produces a lifetime cost to the US economy of $124 billion, equivalent to the cost of the economy of type 2 diabetes or stroke. We're just not trying hard enough to prevent in a comprehensive way, okay? Proper prevention programs don't rely on reducing fat content of the diet. They look at the impact across the whole of society of the risk factors. And if we're really serious about reducing mortality, then we need to be starting a lot earlier. People like Richard Wilkinson are very clear that poverty causes inequality. I don't agree with him. Poverty will cause inequality, but inequality will cause poverty. There's a cycle at work here. What happens is chaotic early life leads to an increased risk of mental health problems, which leads to an increased risk of exclusion from school, increased risk of failure in life that leads to jail, increased sense of worthlessness, lack of purpose in life, which leads to poverty, which in turn leads to chaotic early life for the next generation. It's a cycle. It's not a straight cause and effect. And what I spend a lot of time in prison, and most of the time they let me out. And you talk to 18-year-olds who are about to be released, and you say, what are you going to do when you get out? And what they usually say to me is something along the lines of, I'll never get a job, so what are you going to do? I'll sit at home, I'll watch telly, and I'll drink. And what they never factor into the equation is the fact that the girlfriend will have a couple of babies. And those babies are born into a chaotic household, and the cycle continues. So we need to begin to break that cycle, and in Scotland we decided to start by breaking the chaotic early years. So this, Bruce McEwen, my friend, is part of a group looking at the impact of evidence-based interventions on adults who have experienced these adversities. Told me a couple of months ago that the 3 things that are showing very clear impact are physical activity. More brain blood flow leads to more new brain cells being created, but if you don't use them, you lose them. Mindfulness puts those new brain cells to use, and that's very powerful evidence that mindfulness helps reverse some of this. And creating a sense of social connections around an individual, putting them in a supportive social setting are the 3 things they've got so far. So anyway, what did we decide to do, just to finish with? We decided to do something different. Einstein always says that insanity is keeping on doing the same old thing and expecting different results. We decided we would make policy differently. Okay, this is the typical approach to policy making. What happens is a minister decides he wants to do something, so he gets some experts in a room and they talk for a while, and a civil servant takes minutes, and they go away and they come back a couple of months later, they read out the minutes, they talk a bit more, they take more minutes, and that cycle continues. And then at the end of a year, a brief is written for the minister who says, yes, okay, we'll do that. And that's turned into some kind of implementation plan, which goes out to the service, and nothing happens, okay? Or it might happen a wee bit here and there, but by and large, not a lot happens. And the reason nothing happens is you can't expect people to be committed to a change they've had no say in shaping. You need to involve the front line in shaping the change. So that's precisely what we did. We decided, we asked ministers, we're going to go away and do something here, okay? We'll come back and tell you when we've got something to tell you. And they said, okay. They trusted me by this time. So what we did was we got about 800 people into a room, and these 800 people were people from all 32 counties in Scotland who were involved with childcare, with early years. And we got them to decide what the plan was going to be. And they said, okay, the aim is to make Scotland the best place in the world to grow up. Okay, how are we going to do that? What are we going to change, by how much, by when? And they came up with a series of 4 objectives, measurable, time-bound, and so on. And we said, right, how are you going to make that happen? They said, well, we're not sure, but let us go away and try things. And they went away and they did lots of small tests of change. What they did was, in essence, what turned the British cycling team into world-beaters. British cycling team did 50 or 60 tests of small changes, like changing the way the seams on their speed suits were sewn to reduce drag, making sure that all the cyclists used antiseptic gels. How did that make them cycle faster? Well, they didn't get cold, so they didn't lose training. They did 50 or 60 things, lots of small gain, big gains come from small changes. So by the time our system had done about 600 small tests of change, we began to see things happening. That's what the Early Years Collaborative looks like, all 800 people in the room. This guy here is the permanent secretary, looking suitably relaxed. He came to all our meetings. It was that important. Our finance minister came to a meeting to give a 20-minute speech. He stayed for 5 hours. He left proclaiming this as the single most important piece of public sector reform he'd ever seen. And at the end of it, the first thing we said, well, let's do something that will make a difference. First thing that will see a difference happening is a reduction in stillbirth rate. So they went away and said, right, the folk involved with maternity care and so on, how can we reduce stillbirth rate? Said, we'll reduce it by 15% by 2015. They did it by 2014. It's now 18% down by the end of 2015. He said, right, the next thing we'll see if we're doing things properly will be a reduction in infant mortality. And we've achieved that as well. We actually got infant mortality down a bit before that because we were doing a safety programme using similar techniques in hospitals. But we're down beyond 15%. The next thing is about developmental milestones in 30-month-old kids and at 5 years. We've now started a Raising Attainment for All collaborative where teachers are, and everyone involved in school, beginning to do lots of small tests of change. What we tell them is, break the rules. Do something different. Try it, collect data, try it with 3 people today. If it works, try it with 5 tomorrow. If it works, go and tell everyone about it and spread it. And if it doesn't work, go and tell everyone about it. Information is to be used for improvement, not for judgment. We're not drawing up league tables here. We want to know what works and what doesn't work so we can all do it. We weren't having pilot projects. Pilots are for British Airways. If it's worth doing, we do it at scale. So it's across the whole of Scotland. Now, I just want to finish with some comments. Jimmy Reid was a trade union leader in Glasgow in 1970. Edward Heath's government wanted to withdraw subsidies and so on that would have meant the closure of his shipyard, and he actually made the government stand down, not by taking the workers out on strike, but by taking them into work. They had Upper Clyde shipbuilders working. They locked the gates. They carried on building ships. And he was a fantastic orator. Now, Glasgow University is the fourth oldest university in the English-speaking world, 565 years old, and it still elects, the student body elects the head of the university, Lord Rector. I was a medical student in 1971 when we elected Jimmy Reid Lord Rector. The New York Times published his rectorial address in full and said it was the single most important public speech since the Gettysburg Address. And those of us who were there, I have to say, thought that comparison with Abraham Lincoln was immensely flattering to Abraham Lincoln. It was about alienation, which he described as the cry of men who feel themselves the victims of blind economic forces beyond their control, the frustration of ordinary people excluded from the processes of decision-making, feeling of despair and hopelessness that pervades people who feel with no say, who feel with justification they have no say in shaping or determining their own destinies. Glasgow got austerity 50 years before anyone else. That's what the problem is. People feel hopeless. It's transmitted throughout the family. The children are brought up to have no aspiration, to have no sense of purpose in life, and to have these biological consequences. World Bank predicts that by 2050, there will be 6 cities in the world whose population is over 30 million. Kinshasa, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Lagos, Nigeria. You know, can you imagine 30 million people in the Democratic Republic of Congo? What kind of life is that? You know, unless we understand how we create well-being and a sense of control and a sense of purpose, we're looking into an abyss, I think, with the demographic shifts that we're going to see. So this notion of the creation of well-being is something that we need to get on a firm footing quickly. We're seeing it with these sort of scenes at the moment. The kids who live here are going to have problems, and they're going to be the fodder for the next round of whatever it is, you know, violence and so on, because that is what's happening. And it feels to me that our approach needs to be much more about cuddles than anything else. It needs to be about nurturing. It needs to be about looking out for each other. I came across this quote. Joseph Townsend was a Church of England cleric, and in the early 19th century, he wrote this, that only hunger will spur and goad the poor on to labour. He also had a medical degree, and as a graduate of Glasgow University, I'm delighted to tell you that Joseph Townsend was a graduate of Edinburgh University. But, you know, that kind of attitude is not going to solve these problems. You cannot treat people like animals. You have to treat every newborn baby as a potential Nobel Prize winner. Give them the opportunity to achieve that. And one of the guys, just to finish, one of my heroes is Terry Waite, but that's another story, an amazing man. But this guy, a Catholic priest who 30 years ago was sent to the poorest parish in South Los Angeles, LAPD told him that he would be dead within a week if he tried to change anything that the Latino gang members were up to. This is him a few years on. What he did was he went out and he got to know them. He got to respect them. They respected him. The other guy in the black suit's a film producer. He got this guy to buy a disused bakery, and he started Homeboy Bakeries. He then had to start a second company called Homeboy Tattoo Removal. He said, and you'll forgive the language here, this guy came into him one day and he said, you know, Greg, I've tried so hard to get a job, but no one will employ me. And he looked at him and he had lots of piercings. But the thing is, I was drawn to was the fact that he had tattooed on his forehead, "Fuck the world." He said, yeah, I think I may know your problem, he said. So he got a plastic surgeon friend of his to give him a laser and teach him how to laser off tattoos and so on. And he created Homeboy Industries. Now, Greg comes to Glasgow periodically. I take him round schools where he talks to the kids, and, you know, the stories he tells you are amazing. But one quote that comes from him that I think encapsulates the kind of values that we need to bring to bear on this, and that is, what we need is a compassion that stands in awe at the burdens the poor have to carry, rather than one that stands in judgment at how they carry them. If we approach people at the lower end of the social scale with an understanding of how we might be in their position, and an understanding that their problems may well come from the experience they had within the first days of life even, then we'll be fine. So my injunction to you is, if you're going to try and sort this out, do it. Get your feet wet, get your feet muddy, get out there. I tell our healthcare staff in Scotland, break the rules, but collect the data that shows whether or not it's working. And try something different. Be brave. And while you're being brave, don't forget the cuddles. Thanks very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed. Really fascinating, really hopeful, really inspiring discourse, setting out the evidence for a well-being and wellness approach. Really very, very interesting. Now, this audience has been entertained by what you've had to say. They've been informed by what you have to say, and now I suspect they have some questions about what you've had to say. So, can I see any hands that people who would like to ask a question? Thank you very much for being so prompt.
I was just thinking, you talk quite a lot about meaningfulness and purpose in people's lives. So why they get up in the morning and where they've got to go, and the effects of society on that. But I wondered about like the decline of spirituality as well, and the fact that people don't have something bigger to believe in anymore, in a way. And if you think that's had an effect over the last years in terms of why people.
I'm always, because I've thought a lot about complex system and complex system change, I'm always very wary about attributing an outcome in a complex system to a single cause. And I would find it hard to link up a decline in spirituality to this. I'm not unsympathetic to the notion, but I don't know of any evidence. I think the reason people get out of bed in the morning is it's because they have a kind of inner sense of purpose. They have something they want to do and they need to do it. It's most of my contemporaries, most of the folk that I graduated with are retired now, but I actually think it's quite important that I keep saying the things I say. So it's this sense of belief in what you're doing. So it's not because somebody gives you a job, it's because having a job matters to you. And I think that comes from your early life experience. You know, you're brought up in a house where nobody's worked, father hasn't worked, grandfather hasn't worked, then it's hard for you to become motivated. Having said that, I used to start off these lectures with a picture of some very derelict houses in Glasgow and use that as a sort of setting piece. And one day I was giving the talk to a business school, and the professor of strategic management sitting in the front row gasped, and he said, "That's Acre Hill Street in Black Hill. I was born in those flats," he said, thereby telling me that just because you come from a really poor background doesn't mean that you're fated to be a failure. Quite the reverse. Most of us in this room, go back far enough, will find people in our families have come from a poor background. But something allows them to decide that they want to move on. And it's nurturing family, having a supportive network of people, and having a positive sense of purpose within you that comes from, I think, the nurturing family. So having a sense of having belief in something, whether it be a philosophy or religion or whatever, I think is important, because that helps you answer the problems that you meet on a day-to-day basis. Yeah, could go along with that.
Two hands. I'm going to take you, sir, and I'll take two. If you don't mind taking two together.
Yeah, sure.
My family made its money as brewers and pub owners in the northwest, and I think your description of the alcohol shifted alcohol was very very accurate, and I saw it growing up in the 90s. But I think the big change that I think is a real problem is drinking at home and cheap booze from the supermarket.
Yeah.
And I think I think the challenges that the Scottish government are facing against the drinks industry and the kowtowing of the English government to the drinks industry is a real problem. Do you have any insights into how we might address this and the alcohol?
Yeah, well, take the other question and then come back.
Okay, I mean, it's not very related, but I was very interested in what you were saying about reversing the effects of a difficult life. And you mentioned, is it Bruce McEwen?
Yeah.
But I haven't heard this. I'd be very, very interested to know more. I was particularly interested to know how far those effects of early deprivation on the brain are permanent, and how much real intervention can be in adult life.
Okay, I'll come out to that. The whole drinks thing, I mean, the minimum pricing thing is a way of getting to the cheap booze culture. The European court has said, well, they want more evidence that it would work. Well, I think we're actually going to have to do it to get that evidence. But the Scottish Whisky Association is the major opponent. Scottish Whisky Association is very clever. They always appoint as their Director General a very senior civil servant who knows exactly how the system works. And they've recently changed, and sure enough, this guy is working the system very well. It's the same kind of battle. We had the same sort of battle for many years with the tobacco industry, and we just have to keep plugging away at it. But the culture is definitely very dangerous, and it's not specifically the poor. It's the middle class drinker, the bottle of wine every night kind of thing. That is certainly problematic. And Dame Sally Davis got a bit of a doing in the press over her recent announcements. I was still Chief Medical Officer when that evidence was gathered, and she's right. There is no evidence that any even small amounts of alcohol increase your risk of cancer. There's no level of alcohol that's completely safe or even health producing. So we need to be sensible about it. And if minimum pricing doesn't work, we need to think of something else. Can we reverse it? One of the great Bruce tells me, there's a group of them, Bruce, Jack Shonkoff from Harvard Centre on the Developing Child and so on are getting together. And then Bruce tells me that they are completely convinced about the evidence for these three things can go a long way towards reversing it. The mindfulness thing is very interesting. The guy who has written a lot of books on this is a guy called John Kabat-Zinn. And I was speaking to him a year or so ago, and he told me he started mindfulness in the 1980s when he was working at Massachusetts Medical School, and he started it as a stress reduction program for elderly cancer patients. And one of the things he measured was sense of coherence. And it went up, I think he said about 20%, the score. And he phoned Antonovsky and said, Aaron, I've just increased sense of coherence. And Antonovsky said, that's impossible. It's set by the age of 8 and you can't alter it. And John said that by the time he'd done it 20 times and got the same result, he knew he was right and Antonovsky was wrong. This is a developing field. And my injunction would be, don't accept anything as being irreversible. I've seen dozens of third sector organisations transform people's lives. Guys who, one guy I'm remembering who'd done time for attempted murder and so on, who was deeply troubled, whose life was transformed by a voluntary agency, voluntary body befriending him. And they had patience and they kept with him, they didn't demand anything from him. They were there for him, a bit like Alcoholics Anonymous. And gradually he began to trust them. And then eventually he said, obviously the light bulb moment was these people don't have to do this for me. They must do it because I matter to them. And if I matter to them, I have a responsibility to make some different decisions about my life. And that process you see in all sorts of different transformational organisations. So you can't give up on anyone, I don't think. I've given a lot of talks. There's a thing in Scotland called the Judicial Institute, which is the CPD organisation for judges. And I give a talk where I talk about criminality and the balance between prefrontal cortex inactivity and amygdala hyperactivity. And what I say to them is actually punishing people who have this problem is not logical. They may need to be locked up for their safety or for the safety of the public, but rehabilitation is the answer. And it's funny, the feedback you get, half of them say, this is really interesting and we need to do something about this. The other half say, no, it's of no interest to me whatsoever. The law's the law and I just apply the law. Well, we keep chipping away.
Any other questions? Yes.
I just wondered if you could say a bit more about gender differences, because you haven't said much, and there's been an implicit, I think, focus on males, and in more and more of the evidence, we're seeing very subtle differences in outcomes and influences around gender.
The health outcomes, the inequalities we see are the same in men and women in Scotland. There's no difference. Women are still, in fact, men have come off the top. Women are still at the top on Western European mortality rates. I think there will be subtle differences, particularly around some of the rehabilitation things. What women will respond to may well be slightly different in terms of the model of how you surround them with a supportive environment. Most of the violent criminals I see are men, because that's the way it is. Women tend not to be violent criminals unless they have very serious psychotic illness or something like that. But so I really couldn't answer the question because I don't have data on the subtleties. We did a very in-depth study of about 700 Glaswegians with the brain scans and measuring intimal thickness and so on. And the activation of the stress hormones tended to be greater in men, for what it's worth.
We're going to take a couple more, and then I think we will conclude. So, two gentlemen here.
Do you think the political culture in regard to these kinds of questions is different in Scotland from what it is?
Yeah, well, I was saying outside that our First Minister, I was at a meeting with our First Minister recently, and one of the civil servants described my style of doing things as proceed until apprehended. Actually, someone else went on to say, no, it's proceed until tasered. But, I mean, certainly our ministers are very driven by science. If you say to one of our ministers, as I did, that his decisions would change the way babies' brains develop, he was very moved by that. Mind you, I did choose my minister carefully because I knew he just had a 3-month-old baby at home. So, but the finance minister, who liked the collaborative, asked me that if he found money to support this, would it ultimately save public money? And I didn't want to overpromise. You never overpromise a minister. And so what I said to him was, yes, it would save the country money, but it might take 40 years, but by then he would be closing prisons, to which he replied, that's exactly the right thing to do. So that's a pretty good strategic vision in that particular minister. So I would hesitate to comment about ministers down here, since I've worked more closely with ministers up there, and all I can say is they're smart and they have vision, and that's why I'm still getting to do what I'm doing.
Well, it was a related question, but one of the things that struck me today was the the unhappiest of 42 countries in this WHO survey. And my question was not so much about what do we want our politicians to do so they will make our lives better, but more taking your reference about control and sense of coherence and having 800 leaders of a system within a room and giving them the control to make the changes. And reflecting on work in Scotland as opposed to working in the machinery of government down here, there's something about the permissions that are given and taken, and it's such a compelling argument that you placed out. And one of the slides that really does it for me was the one about the inequalities in the middle, suicide, drink, and other issues that are driving it. What messages would you want us to go away and give to the systems that we work in to try and change the dialogue from illness and deficit to asset and wellness?
The single most important message is that complex systems can't be changed by single solutions. That this is an immensely complex system. I mean, you remember the Foresight report on obesity? There was that graph with all sorts of, cycles and so on. Well, that's just one of dozens of different issues that all have similar patterns. And therefore, the rules about changing a complex system, there are 3 rules about changing a complex system. First of all, you have to destabilize the existing system. You have to make it perfectly plain the existing system is not fit for purpose and it has to change. And everyone needs to sit down and say, yeah, this is really crap. We need to do something different, blah, blah, blah. Second thing is you need simple order generating rules. And a simple order generating rule that we had was let's make Scotland the best place in the world to grow up. And the third thing that's important, and this is the thing that's hard for ministers, is you must allow the solutions to emerge. You cannot say the following 5 things will happen, minister. We will guarantee this and you can put it in a manifesto or whatever. Because if you're going to let the front line design the change, they will come up with things you never in a million years would have thought of. I mean, one of the things they said, if we're in the earliest collaborative, if we're going to get developmental progress accelerated, there's 20 things we need to do. One of them is every child should have a bedtime story. So they went away and they created that. Well, how do we do that? How do we do that? So the nurseries went and they all said, right, we'll ask every child every day, did you get a bedtime story last night? And they graphed it on a run chart. And then they tried things. One of my favourites was bedtime bear. I've got a slide of my granddaughter with her bedtime bear. I can show you it if you really want to. But bedtime bear, every child was given a teddy bear. And bedtime bear needs a story every night before he goes to sleep. So you take him to mummy or daddy and get them to read bedtime bear a story. So the child got the story. So one nursery tried that and then brought the run chart along and it had a huge effect. And then everyone tried it. And then one nursery said, actually, a number of our parents can't read or write. So they set up classes. And before you know, it ripples all the way through. And then there were issues about debt relief and so on. And we now have health visitors working with parents on debt relief. They just broke the rules. They didn't stand on ceremony. If it needed done, and I'm the person who's here, we'll just do it. We gave them permission. And they got so excited by seeing run charts go in the right direction. I'm sure I was the only chief medical officer on the planet who knew how many children in his country were getting a bedtime story every night. And it was 90% for most of these nurseries. So you cannot start off by setting targets. You start off by saying, this is what we want to achieve. We'll try and achieve this by such and such a date, but how we achieve it, over to you, and let's see how it goes. And that requires government that is maybe used to telling the system and shouting about the fact that it's told the system to back off a bit and give the system space, because trust the system and it will achieve great things for you.
That's a perfect conclusion. So, thank you very much for an excellent presentation.